I think it is clear to believe in the power of ideas.
Fresh thinking to the Manhattan Institute.
I'm Howard Husock, Vice President for Policy Research here at the Manhattan Institute. Our previous speakers this morning have given us an expert sense, I think it's fair to say, of the extent and causes of the fiscal problems posed by the pension and other benefit obligations attendant to state and city public employment. We now turn to a second panel, one in which we'll discuss ways to solve the problem and how to ensure that pension funds and other benefit packages are sound and sustainable. At the same time, we're able to maintain the delivery of other important public services. Squaring that circle is both a fiscal and a political challenge, and we'll turn to a panel with expertise in both areas. I guess the equivalent in the pension crisis world of being able to walk and chew gum at the same time is to count votes and calculate discount rates. On my immediate left, Josh Barro is the Walter Wristed Senior Fellow in the Manhattan Institute Center for State and Local Leadership. His recent publications include Dodging the Pension Disaster in the April issue of National Affairs, and his Manhattan Institute studies, Cadillac Coverage, the High Cost of Public Employee Health Benefits, and Uncovering Hidden Cost, Best Practices for Public Pension Transparency. Josh testified in favor of that Paul Ryan, Darrell Issa bill that Joshua Rao alluded to a moment ago. And prior to joining us at the Institute, Josh served as a staff economist at the Tax Foundation, as well as a commercial real estate finance analyst for Wells Fargo Bank. E.J. McMahon is Senior Fellow for Tax and Fiscal Policy at the Manhattan Institute and at our Albany-based Empire Center for New York State Policy. He's the author of Iceberg Ahead, The Hidden Costs of Public Sector Retirement Health Benefits in New York, and with Josh Barro, New York's Exploding Pension Costs. I have to say, EJ has been on this subject for a very long time, sounding the alarm. In 2003, he published our paper, Defusing the Pension Bomb, How to Curb Public Retirement Costs in New York State. He served as Deputy Commissioner for Tax Policy Analysis and as a counselor to the Commissioner in the State Department of Taxation and Finance. Finally, James Hohman, on my far left, is Assistant Director of Fiscal Policy at Michigan's Mackinac Center for Public Policy. He's a frequent contributor in the press in the Great Lakes State about developments in Michigan state politics. He's the author of State Compensation Policy, Bigger Than Advertised, and Benefits in Balance, Saving $5.7 billion annually. That used to be a lot of money, James. I'd like to start with a transition between the point where we left off with the last panel and this crowding out point. You know, some people say one of the most boring phrases in the English language is unfunded pension liability, and we're trying to get you excited about it here today. And E.J., I wonder if you could talk, before we get into plans and resolutions, from your point of view in Albany, and you've been there a while, have you seen, and at the city level, have you seen this crowding out phenomenon really occurring?
Well, we've definitely seen it occurring and unfolding to a greater degree at the local level and at the New York City level. I should point out that New York City, being in effect a state within a state, larger than most state governments fiscally and demographically, is the only sub-state entity in New York State that has its own pension funds, so that every public employee in New York State outside New York City is a member of one of two statewide pension funds. But in New York City has its own pension funds. It has 5 different pension funds, which themselves are among the very largest in the country. New York City, the crowding out effect is not only occurring, it has occurred to an astonishing degree under everybody's nose, and it's almost uncommented upon. In the last decade, including the current fiscal year, in the last 10 years, which coincides with the last fiscal year of the Giuliani administration and the first 9 of the Bloomberg administration. What New York City contributes annually to its pension funds, has increased from about $1.3 or $1.4 billion to this year, $8.4 billion. Now, in other words, the city of New York will spend $7 billion more this year on pension contributions than it did 10 years ago. That's easily an entire additional police department and a parks department and part of sanitation to boot. It's really incredible. This has happened and has gone almost uncommented upon. So I would say that if you want to look at crowding out, I think Exhibit A is New York City. And New York City and state are an interesting laboratory in which to discuss this issue, because if you just go across the river to New Jersey or you go to Illinois, the debate gets all tied up in the foibles of past administrations in both parties which failed to fund their pension systems. So, for instance, people will note that Governor Christie contributed nothing to the pension system last year, and that these have compounded their problems. New York State and New York City are examples of jurisdictions in which attempts have been made to fully fund the pension system. In other words, what does it look like when you have a conventional 20th century American public sector defined benefit system and you attempt to fund it? What it looks like is $7 billion more in 10 years, which I think speaks for itself.
And by the way, Tim Sullivan, who is from the Deputy Mayor's office in New York, said, with that money, you could have built the Brooklyn Bridge Park, you could build the High Line, and he named two or three other projects that are sexier than the sanitation department that you really would want to build. Just with that increment last year to this year, not even the $7 billion over the course of the Bloomberg administration, just the increment last year to this year. Continuing a little bit with the contours of the problem, Josh, we've heard mostly about pension costs this morning. You focus a lot more than just about anybody else on the comparison of public sector health costs with private sector health costs. Could you talk a little bit about the budget implications of that and just sketch what that difference is like?
Sure. So obviously in every part of the economy that has a healthcare component, we've seen a cost explosion over the last 15 years. And a lot of that is outside the hands of state governments. State governments are limited in their ability to combat the fact that we have national healthcare inflation that runs several points above CPI. But there are a number of things that governments could be doing to constrain the costs of their health benefits that they're not doing. And what I did in a paper that I put out recently is I took a look at costs per employee for health benefits that you see in state and local governments and that you see in private employers. And there's been a very interesting trend over the last 15 years, which is that the typical health plan that a public employee received was only very slightly more generous than the typical private sector plan in the mid-90s. But since then, public employee health plan costs have grown about 20% faster than you've seen in the private sector, and we've had a very big gap open. The average benefit value is different by about $800 for single coverage and by about $1,300 for employees receiving family coverage. And when you dig in and you take a look at why, I mean, first you have gaps because public employees are much more likely to get health benefits as part of their job. And I don't think that one of the things we're advocating is that the government should not be providing health insurance to their full-time employees. But even when you just compare workers receiving health benefits, first of all, public employees tend to pay a significantly smaller share of their health premiums, typically about 15%, although it varies widely from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. It would be more typical to pay 25% in the private sector. Then when you look at plan structure, public employees tend to pay lower co-payments when they go to the doctor's office or the emergency room. They tend to have lower deductibles when their plans have deductibles, and they're also more likely to have a plan that has no deductible at all. And so basically what's happened is over the last 15 years, private employers have reacted to healthcare inflation by restructuring their health plans and saying, well, we need to raise your copay, we need to restrict the physician network. There's just been less of that in the public sector. Instead, they've just been passing the bill along to taxpayers. The fortunate thing about this is that it's kind of low-hanging fruit. There's already a demonstrated path in the private sector about how you can do better at controlling these costs, and governments can restructure their health plans to look more like those in the private sector. We're seeing this especially in a lot of states that are raising the share of insurance premiums that have to be paid by employees. We've seen this in New Jersey in the last year, in Wisconsin, in Ohio, Massachusetts, a number of other states under both Republican and Democratic administration. But there are bolder things that states could and should be doing. First of all, raising the employee share of premium is just a cost shift, and while that can be good for taxpayers, it's better if we can cut the cost of health care overall. And so it's good to make changes to a health plan that actually encourage people to be more judicious about consumption. I'm hopeful that Mitch Daniels will talk later today about something that the Indiana state government has done. They've gotten about 70% of their workforce onto HSA plans.
Those are health savings accounts, right?
Yes, so that's a plan where basically you get an insurance plan that it's really insurance. It covers unexpected catastrophic costs, and then you have a savings account that you pay routine costs out of that you and the state jointly fund together. They brought in Mercer Consulting, which is a leading benefits consultancy, to take a look at the results from that. And what Mercer found was that there was roughly a 10% savings due to what they call consumerism, which is basically employees consuming less or less expensive health care because they have more incentives to care about the cost of the care that they're receiving. That's meant a $20 million savings for the state annually, and additionally about an $8 million savings that accrues directly to employees because they pay less out of pocket. And those sound like fairly small numbers, but this is only the state workforce, and Indiana does not have a very large state workforce. If you expanded those savings to all public employees in state and local governments nationally and had similar performance, you'd save about $20 billion a year, which is a little bit less than 1% of all state and local spending in America. So there's a lot of savings available here if governments can just find the political will to achieve it.
So we're starting to see the contours of plans that could begin to bring this problem down to size, increasing the share, the payments by employees themselves, but also restructuring the nature of the benefits. That's kind of the general case of what you've talked about with the specific case of healthcare, restructuring the general approach. And with that in mind, I want to turn to James Hohman from the McMahon Center, because just as Governor Daniels, without a lot of fanfare, signed an executive order which changed the terms of public employment as regards collective bargaining in Indiana, without that much attention, the state of Michigan has been involved in a long-running already change in the nature of pension plans, a change that was initiated with the Republican governor from the 90s. And with that in mind, James, would you tell us the nature of that plan and how's it been working out for you?
Yeah, as Josh mentioned, there's an established private sector trend on more premium sharing, less expensive premiums in the private sector, and that's now spilling over to the public sector. Well, there's an established trend in the private sector of closing pension systems and offering a defined contribution program like a 401k, but that has not really been in the public sector yet. There are a couple of places, and Michigan is one of the few exceptions to the rule. In 1996, the governor, after a contentious election in the general, his support in the Republican House switched over to a Democratic House. And in lame duck section, he looked at...
We're talking about Governor John Engler.
Governor John Engler, yeah. He looked at his opportunities, and he said, I'm going to fulfill one of these campaign promises. And it was a very nasty fight. It wasn't as nasty as what happened in Wisconsin recently, but he had absolutely no support. He was getting hit from all sectors, all government employees about this plan. In fact, one of my colleagues was in the legislature at the time as a legislative director, and he changed his legislator's answering machine to saying, if you were calling about public or House Bill 2076, please hang up. And everyone else just left a message. So, but eventually, when the dust settled on that, he signed a bill the last day of the year, and the public sector, the state employees' retirement system was closed to new members. It had zero fiscal consequences for the first year. There was nothing but political costs that he had to pay. But over the long term, in the 14 years since he's closed that system, the fiscal consequences have been huge. The system was fully funded at the time it closed. It developed an unfunded liability for the employees that were still in there. And we calculated last year that that would have been up to double what it is now, which is it saved about $3.4 billion in unfunded liabilities. And in the state of Michigan, $3.4 billion can get you a lot. And in addition to offering a plan with generally less generous provisions, and that also saves money year after year for the state taxpayer.
And so the close, that means no new entrants into the former defined benefit plan in the state of Michigan, and a migration for new employees to something new, and I assume that's a defined contribution plan, is that right?
And that is a defined contribution plan, and it's set, the state automatically gives 4% of an employee's compensation into the fund, and they can match up to 3%. It's a pretty common plan that you'll find in a lot of private sector provisions. But because it's closed, it takes a long time for that to have fiscal effects. The state did offer an early retirement incentive when they passed the bill, which kind of led to a large first-year category, but it wasn't until just this year that half of state employees are on the new system.
So it took a long time. Okay, we've been throwing around this term defined benefit, defined contribution. Let's zero in on it. And I want to turn back to EJ because he's written about the idea of state employees doing what's been happening in Michigan, migrating, and city employees to defined contribution plans. Could you talk about that, EJ, in a little bit of detail? How does it actually work? What are the range of possibilities? What might be some of the pitfalls, but what do we mean when we say defined contribution for public employees, and how does it contrast to the present?
Well, the traditional defined benefit plan is actually the oldest form of retirement benefit plan. It dates back to the 1800s. In fact, I think the first public plan on record was here in New York City for New York City police officers. To begin with, the appeal of a defined benefit plan was its simplicity. It was a set it and forget it kind of thing, and it was a form of social insurance before Social Security existed. By the 1920s, most places had a defined benefit plan for public safety officers and for teachers and for other civil servants. Again, on the surface, it's simple. You work a certain period of time, you earn a benefit based not, I should stress, on your career earnings, but on your peak earnings, averaged either from over a stretch of time from 1 year out to several years. That, in fact, in turn, that was the basis for many private sector pensions during the heyday of private sector pensions. But even when large corporations, and especially unionized companies, in the mid-20th century offered defined benefit pensions in large numbers, defined benefit pensions in the public sector never had benefits on average at the level of public sector pensions. Public sector pensions were more generous. Now, the key issue with defined benefit pensions is that while they seem simple on the surface, and they certainly are a thing of simple beauty from the standpoint of the worker, they really provide the ultimate proof of P.J. O'Rourke's dictum that giving money and power to government is like giving whiskey and car keys to teenage boys. Because it actually creates an enormous concentration of financial power and financial risk, open-ended, that is opaque, poorly understood, and calculated in very complex ways. And it creates avenues for a current generation of politicians in each generation to make promises that don't have to be paid for till the following generation. And that's the key problem with defined benefit systems, is that, in fact, to make this seemingly simple system work requires a series of extremely complicated calculations and actuarial assumptions, which are shifting and which are affected by things like greater longevity. And the net result of all that is liability, and unfunded liability, to cite two of the three most boring words in the English language, as Howard mentioned. And government is not good at dealing with unfunded liabilities, and which is one of the subject of our previous panel. That's the fundamental structural problem with a defined benefit system. Now, I want to mention one other thing about the perverse incentives that a defined benefit system creates. In the private sector, the same sort of abuses occurred in private sector terms. Corporations abused their pensions. They looted their funds when they had excess investment gains. They played games with their accounting to make their balance sheets look better. They did all sorts of things they shouldn't have done. The contrast between the private and public sector is that private sector workers and retarees actually suffered in many cases because of those abuses.
Because of the lack of what Josh Rao was calling the implicit public insurance.
There was no implicit public put for a private sector pension. A lot of private sector retirees, that's nothing to celebrate either that they suffered because that's the problem. DB pensions didn't actually work well in the private sector either, and when accounting standards were tightened, corporations moved away from them. And that's why, and the whole issue now is whether the public sector will do the same.
And so that lack of transparency is something we've been hearing about. It's simple on the surface, complex in the back end in terms of where the costs are ultimately going to lie and who's going to pay for them. But Josh Barro, is defined contribution plan, is it just a simple, easy fix in that case?
Well, I think that the accounting is certainly far simpler in the defined contribution plan, and it's also much simpler from the perspective of the taxpayer in that once the benefit is paid to the employee in their year of employment, there is no liability that is created for taxpayers in out years. The contribution is made up front, and then all the management of that money is placed on the employee. I think we've seen a number of barriers, though, to states moving to defined contribution systems for a variety of reasons, and there are reasons that Michigan and along with Alaska have essentially stood alone in terms of major public employers making this shift. Although I would note that many state university systems have been on defined contribution systems for many decades.
Including the state of New York.
Including the state of New York, where there is an option, but I believe a large majority take the defined contribution option. That partly has to do with the structure of the workforce. University faculty expect to move around during their careers and so may not want a 30 and out structured pension. But so in terms of the reasons why this has not caught on across the country, I think first of all, there have in some cases been structural problems with defined contribution pensions. And I would note that there are significant widespread problems with defined contribution pensions in the private sector. Savings rates in general in the economy are far too low. Many employers offer defined contribution retirement plans that are poorly structured. Particularly, they have a significant cost disadvantage with large and I would say economically inexplicable fees that eat away at the savings that employees put into them. That is not a necessary feature of defined contribution pensions. States can and should, when moving to defined contribution, choose plan options that both have low fees and that offer appropriate risks and returns to employees. But that doesn't mean that they necessarily will. There was a little bit of a fiasco with an attempt to move to a defined contribution in the state of West Virginia, where the state made some poor choices in the plan structure. As Josh Rao alluded to, there are also some challenges with the fact that about a third of state and local employees in the country do not participate in Social Security. And so if they had no defined benefit pension, they would have no annuity-style income in retirement at all. And so you have to figure out what to do in those cases. For example, you could have them retain a small DB pension. You could move into Social Security, but then you have to start paying Social Security tax. So I think that there are first of all, there are some structural issues that can be resolved, but that in some cases are somewhat difficult to resolve. You've also seen legal barriers to pension reform in a number of states, particularly if you want to apply the reform to new employees, even for benefits that will be earned in future years. In New York, once an employee comes on the payroll, if they've been on the payroll for a day, they are constitutionally entitled to their same retirement deal for the entirety of the rest of their career with the state of New York. So, and that's also true if you work for a municipality. So you can compare this into the private sector, where if your private employer says, I want to terminate my pension plan, they have to let you keep whatever you've earned in the pension plan to date, but they do not have to allow you to continue accruing in the future. New York and a handful of other states are under a requirement to do that, and so their hands are significantly tied on reform. There have also been significant political barriers to reform. Unions have fought tooth and nail against both reductions in the generosity of pensions and especially against structural reforms like defined contribution. I'd note also that there are also institutional interests that fight in favor of retaining pensions. It's a significant source of power for certain officials in the state to be able to run a pension fund and control the investment pool of that pension fund.
We've noticed that here in New York.
Yes, yeah. And so I think, we've seen occasional instances where that's used for good. There were a couple of Indiana pension funds that were the last parties fighting against the settlement that was forced on Chrysler's secured creditors because they were among the few entities that couldn't be browbeaten by the Obama administration into not objecting. But on average, I would say that the influence that those funds are exerting on corporate governance has been negative. But it is a significant source of power that officials do not want to give up, and there's a whole lobby for pension administrators who would be out of a job if states gave up the defined benefit pension business. And I think those, unlike public employee unions, the retirement administrators are viewed as somewhat neutral parties that are supposed to be experts on what retirement should be like, but in fact they want to perpetuate the existence of the institutions they run. But I'd say that the most important barrier that has blocked defined benefit has been a very frustrating one because
defined contribution.
Defined contribution is very frustrating because it is completely made up, and it is accounting barriers that exist that discourage states from moving to defined contribution pensions. And this comes out of those GASB standards that we were complaining about a little bit.
GASB is what?
Sorry, the Government Accounting Standards Board, which
everybody else in the room knows, but I wanted to make sure that I knew.
Yes. So basically, what happens when a state comes to GASB and says, I want to close my pension plan, GASB will say, okay, now you must drastically speed up your efforts to pay off the unfunded liability in the fund because you are closing it. This doesn't make a lot of sense from first principles in accounting. I won't go into too much detail. It's actually the rule on what to do with a closed fund is correct. The rule on what they're allowed to do with an open fund is incorrect, but is favorable in that it effectively allows them to borrow money implicitly. What I usually say to state lawmakers who get hung up on this is if you don't like the GASB guidance, ignore it. You're probably breaking GASB rules in 50 other ways already. People don't tend to find that too convincing. They seem to have this idea that you're supposed to follow accounting rules. But the result of this is that there's an apparent, people will call it a transition cost with moving to defined benefit pensions. There is no real transition cost with a move to defined benefit pensions. What people are seeing is the need to pay off the unfunded liability in the legacy system. You have to pay off that unfunded liability whether you close the pension system or not. But I think both the supporters of the defined benefit system have used this accounting complication to their advantage. I think a number of state-level officials have gotten honestly confused about this issue and think that there's a transition cost where there's not. But the upshot of that is that they get this GASB guidance and they say, well, if we close the plan, we'll have to put another $100 million in the plan next year in order to comply with GASB guidance on what the contribution should be. And
let me turn to James on that, since he experienced that. Was Michigan forced to do that? Because you actually did close a plan.
Well, actually, because the system was fully funded when they closed it, they didn't have to deal with that. They also explored doing what they did for the state plan to the school plan, which involved a lot more members, a lot more political backlash. And one of the deal breakers for the fiscally prudent Republicans was exactly that issue, is that there was an unfunded liability in the teacher pension plan, and the accounting standard boards did say, hey, you're going to have to send in an extra $30 million, which is, of course, nothing in the state budget, but the Republicans were too afraid to deal with that. Now,
did they put in that extra money?
No, they kept that system open, and they let a $3 billion unfunding issue develop into a $20 billion unfunded liability issue from 1996.
Right, so that was the point you made previously. Even if you're going to have a ongoing cost with continued accrual of liability.
But even beyond that, going to Josh's point on states not really abiding by accounting standards anyway when they're not convenient for them, Michigan is a perfect example of that. Since 1996, for this teacher pension plan, they've marked to market, they've messed around with their actuary assumptions, they've done specific things to make sure that they have not been providing their annual required contribution or artificially making that required contribution lower. Whereas its defined contribution system, as EJ said, they set it and they forgot it. It was 4% and with a 3% match, and they haven't changed a single thing about that system since.
Right, so let's keep that in mind. 4% from the state and a 3% match, because we keep talking about defined contribution. How does it really work? That's how it really works.
Yeah.
Is that match. But I would like to push you a little bit, James, on what's the experience like for the employee? We're looking at this from the global point of view, crowd out of services. Do employees like this? And if so, how do you know they like it?
Well, there hasn't really been too much of a survey of members. I can tell you as a practical consequence, we have one of the arguments against the defined contribution reform was that employees wouldn't like it, you wouldn't be able to find qualified members. It has not been the case. We have 10 times more job applications in Michigan than job openings.
And that's only because of the defined contribution plan, right?
Yeah, probably not. It might have something to do with our 12% unemployment rate, but you know.
No, I didn't mean to. But seriously, it's unremarked upon. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it's if there were dire consequences, they've yet to show up. The fiscal consequences, though, were pretty potent.
Interesting. EJ, you wanted to get in?
Well, I think that when we begin to talk about shifting to a defined contribution system, and I think Josh alluded to this a bit, one of the problems in the political debate is the fact that, in fact, the typical 401k plan, without generalizing to too great a degree, I think research has found that the typical 401k plan is, to put it kindly, not very good. Especially even among small employers. Somebody's been sold a bill of goods by some mutual fund, there's a high fee deal, there's a minimal contribution which may be suspended on the employer's side in bad times. And there's a default choice that essentially is a money market account, and the psychology of pre-retirement planning is such that everybody who's young thinks they're never going to be old, and they pay no attention to it and refuse to make a choice. In large corporations will do these things where they tend to overinvest in their own stock or in certain asset classes. And again, even a large sophisticated corporation will be sold or partner with a financial firm in a plan that's not necessarily very good. There's some private corporate plans that are pretty good, but they tend to be more the exception than the rule. And so I think that one of the discussions we need to have in this front is what a good defined contribution plan would look like, because the ubiquitous straw man shows up in all kinds of debate, and the straw men usually are not just complete shadows, but grounded in some way in reality. And the reality in this case is just what people do know about 401k plans. And by the way, technically it would not be there was no such thing as a government 401k plan. There's a government 401a plan. So I think that's one question. Secondly, then there's the question, if public sector unions, which is largely the adversary here, or employee groups in the right to work states where their power is more amorphous, ever got into a serious discussion, which I think they eventually will or be forced into in more places, of what the alternative might look like, I think you'll quickly find that a plan like Michigan's with a 4% employer contribution and a 3% employee match, you're not going to get away with something that inexpensive, and you should be happy to come away with something that has a fixed, sustainable, known rate in which you immediately discharge your liability.
What makes that inexpensive?
Because the debate's going to come around to the thing that defined benefit pensions are about, which is wage replacement in retirement. When people get close to retirement age and focus on retirement, then they begin to think about wage replacement. What am I going to have to live on compared to what I'm making now? In places and states that have a Social Security component with public sector retirement, the Social Security and the public pension combined now do something you can't replicate and should not try to replicate with defined contribution, which is, in states like New York, you're talking about wage replacement of over 100% if you're a career employee. You're a career employee at all but the very, very highest pinnacle levels of the salary scale in government, and you work 35 to 40 years in government and retire at the Social Security retirement current age of 65 or even 62, the day you start your retirement, you will be pulling down more between the tax-free pension and Social Security than you were earning when you worked. Now, more, slightly more. In fact, the wage replacement rate, there was a study done recently by, and Josh Rao probably knows the guy's name, but I can't remember his name, who looked at all the public pension systems in the country. At Times did a big story on this. New York State's replacement rate was, on average, not counting Social Security, was 77%. Now that's also bolstered by police and fire, who tend to get 50% pensions, including lots of overtime in their final years, so they can get pensions that are larger than their salaries. But when you start talking about wage replacement, if you're in a non-Social Security mode to start with, and you're putting away only 7% of salary per year through your working lifetime, you're not going to have a wage replacement rate, depending on imputed returns, that's more than maybe 50% or so. The numbers can vary depending on what your returns are. So the question is the level of security in the returns and the way that the fund is designed, and in the target level of wage replacement you're looking for. And that can begin a productive discussion where you look at things such as the higher ed system, where TIAA-CREF, the Teachers Insurance Annuity Association, was founded almost 100 years ago by Andrew Carnegie to create teacher pensions, and ended up funding private sector versions of annuitized pension-like retirement streams for university professors. That's existed in higher ed in the public sector for 50 years or more, depending on the system you're in, including New York. You can begin to look at programs like that, because the other thing, when you get into the debate, when you do a live debate on this in a public forum involving politicians who are willing to think seriously about it, and an audience that includes both private sector and public sector workers, both sets of whom have not thought much about retirement, say, because they're middle-aged or younger. What's daunting and what they find hard to get their arms around is the managing of one's own fund. And so the question is how you get into that. This brings out, and then you get it brings out the potentially destructive paternal instinct in politicians and the desire to take care of everything. The defined benefit system, needless to say, is turnkey. You don't even think about it. By the way, personal experience, people who work in government, when they reach middle age, begin to think about it. By the time they're in their 50s, they're all but crossing off days on the calendar, and the elevator conversation is 2 more years till I hit my, retirement. I mean, that's
so it sounds like you're saying that the politics of selling a defined contribution plan is not simple. The plan has got to be reasonably straightforward, easy to grasp, a match that's big enough so that people can approach wage replacement, but probably it's never going to be as attractive as alternative to the employees themselves as defined benefit.
Well, depending on if the employee is a lifer in government, you can't provide an absolutely guaranteed, taxpayer guaranteed, income replacement stream at the level government now does, guaranteed. Could you replicate it in a good period with the right investment mix? Yeah. Could you guarantee it for everybody at all times? No. You can't do it. So the question is, how good a plan can you come up with? Can you even have a discussion that's fruitful enough to create potential models for the private sector? Because I think people who look at this issue realize that, the retirement planning model in the private sector is not exactly, sterling either.
Well, to Doug Schoen's point that he made in the earlier panel, then, to get the defined contribution model in force, you need reinforcements from other interest groups. You're not going to simply be able to turn the public employees to say, oh yeah, this is a lot better.
Well, the other problem is, this works to our advantage and our disadvantage. In New York, the fact that there's a strong constitutional prohibition on any impairment or diminishment or change of the pension benefit, as Josh cited, it works to our advantage in debates because it's crystal clear, or should be, that you're not talking about touching anyone who's now got something, not just retirees, but somebody who's now working. I would say that in every place this debate has occurred, including in sort of a miscalculated proposition by Governor Schwarzenegger in California about 7 years ago, every place this debate heats up and becomes serious, the first thing unions do is resort to scare tactics and attempt to convince their current members and retirees that this is going to take away something from you, even when it won't.
Right, so
That's
it's
the
a
first
version
hurdle.
of the national entitlement debate.
It's the version of it's very much like the national entitlement debate, where the changes we know we need to make in eligibility and benefit levels for future recipients of Medicaid and Social Security end up heating up a room full of 82-year-olds who are not going to be affected in the least by anything you're talking about.
But let me turn to you, Josh, and ask you this. You know, it's difficult to imagine alternatives to the status quo, and there's going to be complications. But as an accounting matter and a fiscal matter, what if we just stay on the present course? What kind of where is that leading us, both in state fiscal terms and any other terms that you want to elucidate?
Well, I think it depends on the jurisdiction you're in, and this is the complaint I always get when I debate these issues with people from the left is that they say, well, it's not a national crisis. It's localized in different jurisdictions, and I'd say it is a national crisis, but the severity is very different depending on where you are. In Rhode Island right now, you have the small city of Central Falls that is in bankruptcy, and the city has just simply unilaterally sharply cut pension payments, in many cases by about half to existing retirees.
Now, let's just I want to make sure everybody gets that really quite clear, because Doug Schoen talked about the polling data which said don't cut current retiree benefits. Josh Ra was willing to go out on a limb and say maybe we can limit their cost of living adjustments. What you're saying is exactly what happened in Rhode Island?
Well, in many cases, pensions have been cut by about half. It's simply the city's out of money. The pension fund, it's a municipal pension fund. There's no money left in it, so it's not even really a pension fund anymore. So the city just has to figure out what bills it can pay with the tax receipts that are currently coming in. It's a low-income jurisdiction. There is not significant economic room to collect more taxes. They've already pushed the property tax bill up substantially. And so it's a question of, do we pay firefighters and sanitation workers who are working today, or do we send checks to retirees? And there have been cuts on both sides, but there's been no option other than sharp cutbacks to current retirees. And unlike private sector pension beneficiaries, there is no pension benefit guarantee corporation coverage.
That's the federal agency which gives a certain amount of the pension benefit to private plans beneficiaries which have gone bankrupt.
Right. So if you were a pilot for United Airlines and United went bankrupt, you were at least getting some portion of your benefit from the PBGC. There is no safety net like that for public workers. It's just the city's own books, which are too strapped, and then the state of Rhode Island has taken a step back and is not bailing out the city.
So is that what we can expect to see in a lot of jurisdictions?
Not in a lot of jurisdictions, but we will see situations like that in a number of other jurisdictions. Rhode Island's a very interesting place right now because they're just entering a special session on pension reform. While Central Falls is the most troubled jurisdiction, there are a number of pension funds and overall city budgets that are teetering on the brink of insolvency in Rhode Island. The city of Providence is very seriously troubled, the city of Warwick, and a number of other jurisdictions. And then the state pension fund is one of the worst funded in the country, and the state is looking at a roughly $7 billion unfunded pension liability on a population of 1 million. And that's using regular accounting standards. If you applied proper market value techniques, you would actually find a significantly larger unfunded pension liability. And the state is looking at that and basically saying this is not a liability that we can afford to service going forward. So it looks very likely there that you're going to see cutbacks to benefits, including for current retirees through a cut of the cost of living adjustment, and then more severe cuts for current and future workers. In addition to significant devotion of tax proceeds to shoring up the pension funds, just because it is unaffordable in Rhode Island to continue going on doing what's been done.
So in a way, that's the farthest point out on the curve, but an instructive one, where we get the combination of crowd out and cuts in benefits.
Exactly.
Which is the status quo continued.
Right. And then you see other jurisdictions like New York, where our state pension funds were reporting slightly over 100% funding just going into the crisis. I think they will bottom out somewhere around 80%. Again, that's using the rosier accounting standards than you should be, but they are among the best funded in the country. And what we've seen in New York is the way that you do that is by pumping tremendous amounts of money into the funds. EJ and I put out a paper about a year ago now projecting what the contribution rates will be for the state's pension funds, and basically state governments all over New York will be contributing greater than 20% of payroll as pension contributions.
And so that we're not talking only the state, we're talking about the local school districts.
Right. The contribution increases that we expect in school districts will require a 3.5% increase in property tax each of the next 5 years just to pay for pension costs.
But we're under a property tax cap.
Right.
From which it's been partially excluded, and therefore it will crowd out other things.
Crowd out other things.
Right.
That's where we're going with all of this, isn't it?
Right. So I think in New York what you're going to see is really severe crowd out problems, and you're going to see over the long term needs for tax increases, whether that's handled in the form of property tax or state level taxes, because those are your only options if you can't cut the costs. And I think the pattern we've seen even with pension changes for future workers in New York has not been very inspiring in terms of the long-term savings that generates. So you have other states where the benefits are less generous and where the problems won't be as severe, but I think the New York and Rhode Island give you the examples of what happens if you decide you can't pay or if you decide you must pay.
So EJ, what do you see as the most politically practical and palatable way forward here in New York?
Well, to begin with, you're not going to be moving forward in any direction unless I think elected officials at the executive level do the leading. It's pretty clear to me, in fact, this goes back to a previous generation of so-called pension reform in New York, and I think in other states, if you look around the country, that if you don't have a governor in the lead with structural change, legislatures do not drive reform. Legislators can be important figures in educating the public. One of them, Mike Fitzpatrick, is right here with us. Assemblyman Mike Fitzpatrick. In a previous generation, there was an assemblyman or state senator, John Faso remembers his name, Fred Eckert, who later became Ronald Reagan's ambassador to Fiji, who spent much of the late 1970s driving around upstate New York educating people on the pension explosion. And it actually sort of contributed to a pension reform that occurred at that time and which was naturally undone. I think there isn't a promising start, and to channel Mike Fitzpatrick once again, I'm increasingly coming around to and recognizing the importance of one thing he points out. If there's a single most important first step you can take, it is to take elected officials and political appointees out of all defined benefit systems in government everywhere. Absolutely, immediately. And in fact, arguably, even in systems with constitutional guarantees, you may be able to attempt to do this and interrupt their benefit stream in mid-career because your employment ends with each term in effect. You don't have a continuous period. So one might even attempt it in mid-career, although practically speaking, you'd probably have to grandfather in, which given the career duration of New York State legislators.
So you're suggesting a legal argument here.
But I'm sorry, I'm practicing without a license. But given the career duration of New York legislators would be really long. But it really is, the incentives are just pernicious, and it creates, as Mike says, a culture that's very bad. In fact, you get in the political culture a sort of distorted version of what occurs in the workforce. And by the way, everything I'm about to say is not to say that the human beings involved are less virtuous than other human beings. They are responding the way people respond to incentives. If you are locked into a career-long job that by its very nature inhibits any recognition of your performance and has all the other attributes of a civil service system, and you come looming down the road, you suddenly see this enormous holy grail, which, if you game it somewhat, can get even bigger and more valuable, you're going to do it. Now, put politicians in that situation, and you realize after you serve several terms in office at multiple levels, all in the same pension system, qualifying for pension time every step of the way, and often for current and retiree health insurance as well, you realize that the longer you stay in it by hook or by crook, the more your benefits will be. That's another important factor driving this. And also, people think politicians are shameless. They're not completely in any event. What I find is I talk to a lot of politicians, often and usually in deep, dark private, given the nature of the subject, about pension reform. And there is a great deal of self-consciousness on the part of politicians about the fact that, hey, wait a minute, I'm in this system. How am I going to talk about this? I think you absolutely have to start there, and again, also with political appointees, which would be doing a favor to the public, because a lot of high-grade executive potential political appointees are reluctant to get into government because you say to them, the tabloids or the newspapers will say, look at this guy we're hiring to run the MTA. We're paying him $1 gazillion, okay? But that guy's a top-notch corporate executive, and you're paying him $1 gazillion, and you're bringing him into a public pension system where he can, toll up a couple of years worth of credits that won't be worth too much.
Because they're not
You
portable.
can't port it. It's not portable.
They're not
You
portable.
can't take it anywhere.
So just to underscore, your prescription then for New York and other places is close the door.
Close the door.
Now.
All elected officials.
And that's what happened, James, in Michigan, is they closed the door. Now, of course, what you're telling us, it happened in a lame duck session wrought by a governor who was not running for re-election.
That's absolutely the case, but they did also do it for legislators. There are 2 people left in the system right now of staff members that have kind of stuck around since then. So all of Michigan's legislators are off the pension system. And as we're exploring reforming our teacher pension system, we're going to see whether that has some fiscal consequences for how they approach the issue.
Right, so you would endorse EJ's prescription, which is
absolutely.
Close the drawbridge or lift the drawbridge now.
And they'll recognize the alternatives. They'll see that, hey, we're going to be treating teachers exactly the way we're treated, and we think we're doing fine.
I don't want to forget one of the big strands that we had earlier in the morning was the politics of all of this. Dan DeSalvo was making points about his personal contributions to an agency shop and all of that. Did that change in Michigan? Was that flow of dues? I was talking to somebody from a state government who's here today saying that lifeblood of union dues being deducted by the state from the individual paychecks of workers is a key. Did that change at all in Michigan?
Not yet. We're actually exploring that right now, especially for teachers. The biggest, most powerful union, or probably lobby in the entire state, is the Michigan Education Association, affiliate of the National Education Association, and they fought any plan, even when it's not affecting their members, on closing off any pension system. So they're a huge issue. They are the biggest reason why we haven't closed our defined benefit pension plan for public schools.
Right. Well, we have a little time left for questions. Please, same rules apply as before. Wait for the microphone. Identify yourself in the form of a question. And there's a gentleman way in the back with whom I'd like to start.
Hi, Colin Hitt from the Illinois Policy Institute. Professor Rao mentioned earlier the need to tackle cost of living adjustments where possible. In Illinois, our home state, it's 3% compounded per year automatic for almost everybody except for the newest employees in the systems. Our constitutional language, EJ, is very similar to New York's. What have your courts said about any attempts to COLA adjustment, any attempts to reform COLA payments?
Our courts have said nothing. I believe, by the way, that the Illinois language, which I think dates back to 1970 or so, was actually consciously taken word for word from the New York language, which is from 1939, and closely paraphrasing says that the benefits of membership in a retirement system are contractual in nature and shall not be diminished nor impaired. That's what it says.
But
now,
you did offer a way forward a moment ago, but that's
right.
not a strategy that's been tested.
That's not it. And I was talking about elected officials. There are many assumptions surrounding what that means in New York. It's actually not been litigated that much. The one clear path, the litigation has been over changes in funding levels and in actuarial methods, and the court has made it clear you can't do that in any way that can be considered a diminishment. Now, by the way, you're probably aware in Illinois, I think there was a legal interpretation from a leading law firm that suggested that there was a way, even under the identical constitutional language in Illinois, to in effect close pension plans or to alter the level of tolling of pension benefits going forward, as long as you ensured that people kept what they had earned. Common sense might suggest to most of us that that's what that provision means. I can only tell you that in New York, it's widely assumed, largely on the basis of penumbras and emanations, as the Supreme Court once said, as opposed to specific litigation, that you can't touch anything, don't even think about it. You can change it for a new hire, but you can't change it from an existing employee. We don't have, by the way, we have a small COLA in our pension. We didn't used to have one. It's more limited and capped than the Illinois one. And it is not, its elimination wouldn't make as big a difference to our situation. So I wish I could offer more on it, but I would observe also that even in states where it's pretty clear, where there isn't a constitutional provision, such as the one we have in Illinois and New York, where in fact there's an absence of any clear statutory guidance. I believe that's the case to a certain degree in New Jersey. And it's also the case, with regard to some pensions, I believe even in California, there's been, the political system, if you will, has been reluctant to actually go near it. Now, there have been, again, the exceptions were mentioned, Minnesota, for instance. Wisconsin was not changing the pension system. Wisconsin was changing a previous contractual commitment in which employers were kicking in the employees' pension contribution for them, but the actual contribution was not changed. So far, we've seen very few employers go near it, even when they have the legal room to do it. That's by no means says that none do. And to give you another, adding to the legal hopper, one last thing, there was a decision in Rhode Island by a Superior Court judge just last week that actually may be taken as an indication that there's less freedom to change the Rhode Island benefits in midstream than we had thought.
It's interesting, though, E.J., Governor Walker reminded us that the effects of his actions has been to improve the economic climate in the state. So it may be that in those states in which there is more freedom of action, that may be a comparative advantage amongst the states, and there may be some incentives. We tend to talk about the disincentives and the barriers, but perhaps in the medium term there could be some incentives for making the change. In other words, let's not be too negative. That's where I'm going with that. Other questions? Yes, the young lady right there on the right.
Julie Killian, New Yorkers for Growth. EJ, do you have any statistics on wage replacement for private sector workers as compared to the high numbers for public sector?
Wage replacement for private sector?
Yeah.
The only thing I've seen is that there's something done actually by Social Security Administration about 6 or 7 years ago that suggested that the remaining defined benefit pension plans offered by large corporations typically offered wage replacement in the range of, I think, 47%. Now, that would be the remaining large corporate pension plans, say the GE plan, for instance. Newer large corporations, Microsoft or Apple, don't have any defined benefit pension plan, for instance. So it'd be apples to oranges. And the concept of wage replacement is not one we often talk about with regard to a 401k, because a 401k is a hunk of money which you then deal with once you retire after you've amassed an accumulation. It is a concept that comes into pension discussions, and it is used in discussions of the TIA-CREF annuitized approach that's used in the public sector university systems. And so the data are scant on this, necessarily because it's not a concept one builds into a 401k on the private sector. But again, and by the way, I've looked on a snapshot basis as part of my research in the past, directly and through other research by, for instance, the GAO in the 90s, at the public sector big plans. And again, the wage replacement rates and the overall career wage replacement rates in public sector plans in their heyday was probably 1/2 to 2/3 at best the level of a typical public sector plan. There's one other aspect of private sector.
Private was less
wage. And one other thing I should mention that was almost universal among private sector defined benefit plans. For example, the UAW. The UAW you would think of as the gold standard of the old line industrial union worker. They could retire early, big generous health benefits, etc. What UAW's pension had, which is common to other private sector pensions, is what's known as a Social Security offset. That is, once you began collecting Social Security, your pension was reduced. Whenever you began collecting Social Security, under the planted axiom being, well, you don't need this whole pension now, you're getting Social Security. That's virtually unheard of in the public sector. Among public sector workers who are in the Social Security system, they get 100% of their Social Security benefit and 100% of their pension. There's a wrinkle to this in New York due to a weird interplay of legislative actions and inactions in the end of Governor Patterson's term. Newly hired cops and firefighters in New York City are back in the briefly reformed New York pension system of the 70s, which does have an offset. That is, you begin collecting Social Security and your pension is reduced. If you look back in the news coverage of public sector pension reform debates in the 70s, which is when we last had a full-blown crisis for different reasons, much of the focus was on simply introducing discounts into public sector pensions. So that was kind of that era's version of the discussion.
Okay, other questions? Yes, right over here on the left.
Joe Coletti with State Policy Network, and Josh started off his comments talking about healthcare benefits for state employees, and I look at, and I think James has a paper talking about compensation as well, and I'm looking at this as the total compensation package, how much state employees get paid, how they get paid. I think Governor Walker mentioned pay for performance, the benefits that they receive on healthcare side, the pension that they receive. How do you put that all together into a package? Because I know a lot of state employees will also say, sure, I'll be willing to put more money into my healthcare or more money into my pension, just pay me more. How do you address how do you put all that into a package that's sellable to a state employee?
Sure. So a couple of things. First of all, the usual line that you hear from public employee unions is, yes, our benefit package is more generous, but we receive lower wages for comparable jobs, and it ends up washing, or we're underpaid or something. And there have been a number of these studies sponsored by the Economic Policies Institute, which is a labor-backed think tank, generally finding that employees, depending on the state, are roughly paid at parity or underpaid. There are a couple of significant problems with these studies, and they relate to the accounting issues that we've discussed today. Basically, because of the same accounting standards that allow pension funds to understate their liabilities, they also understate the cost of the pension benefits that they're providing to employees. And when you properly value those pension benefits, and then when you also value the ability to receive health benefits in retirement, which is very rare in the private sector, quite common in the public sector, and because of a data limitation from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, it's actually very difficult to figure out exactly what the value of those benefits are on a national basis.
And you're talking about benefits for people who retire early at 55, but they're not yet eligible for Medicare, and they would get their health benefits paid for by the state, as here in New York.
Right, and so it varies how much of their premium is paid for by the government, but in many cases it's a substantial part, and then many also continue to receive benefits once they become eligible for Medicare. For example, their Medicare Part B premiums can be paid by the government. They can receive Medigap coverage. These are very valuable benefits, especially because when you discount them, you have to consider the fact that we expect healthcare to get a lot more expensive in the future. So, in fact, it may be worth more for me to say to you that I'll pay for your health plan in 10 years than that I'll pay for your health plan this year. So basically, Andrew Biggs from the American Enterprise Institute has done a lot of work on this, and it seems to, depending on the state, be maybe a 15% increment to compensation when you properly value the retirement benefits and when you count the health benefits. One other problem I would say that we have with these studies is they assume that a master's in education is a valuable degree worth compensating. I'm serious. When you look at the data on teacher performance, and our own Marcus Winters has looked at this, teachers with master's degrees are not any better than teachers with bachelor's degrees in terms of achieving good outcomes for their students. And yet these studies are based on this principle of pay parity, where you sort of assume that because a teacher has a master's degree, they should be compensated on a par with somebody who has a master's in engineering or such, when I would venture that a teacher looks more like a bachelor's degreed professional than a master's degreed professional. Although I'll probably get tomatoes thrown at me if I say that in the wrong forms.
Well, that brings us back to Governor Walker's observation that the change in collective bargaining untied the hands of local school boards just in that regard.
Exactly. And so I would venture that on average, and though it's going to depend from state to state, you are seeing a significant pay premium in the public sector, and that means that governments can reduce compensation without having to concern themselves too much about drawing talent. But the other thing I'd note is that it doesn't just matter how much your total compensation is, it really matters how the compensation package is structured. And for some reason, we've decided that we're going to pay government employees with these benefits-heavy packages, which are not necessarily attractive. I would rather have $10,000 in cash than $10,000 in health benefits. but for a number of reasons, including that it is easier budgetarily to hide non-wage income than wage income, we have given out these benefit packages that are not only expensive, they result in a deadweight loss. The employee values them less than it costs the government to provide them. There was a fairly alarming study out of Stanford last year that looked at a pension sweetener that was offered in Illinois. Basically, like many states about a decade ago, they gave out this big pension benefit increase because the state felt rich. And you could get it retroactively, but you had to make a buy-up payment in order to get it. And it varied depending on your length of service, how sweet that deal was. But for almost everybody, it was a good deal. 99% of teachers who were offered this deal could expect a 7% guaranteed return or better on their buy-up payment. But many declined to make the payment, even though in many cases it was much better than a 7% return. And what the study found was that teachers valued that benefit only at about 17 cents on the dollar on average. So we spend $1 on pension benefits, and the employee views that as being as good as being paid 17 cents in cash. So this is just a huge waste of money.
It's a really interesting answer to the gentleman's question then, Josh. What you're saying is that it may be possible as a matter of salesmanship to say, well, you might want cash up front because you may not want to spend your life in state government. You may want to take care of your own assets,
Right.
and that rather than saying you don't compare well to the private sector, you may say, actually what you've got in this new formulation is better.
Right. Yeah, it's essentially, this doesn't all have to be a zero-sum game. By restructuring employee compensation to be more cash-heavy, we might be able to make both taxpayers and public employees better off in some cases.
Very interesting. Over here, Byron Ween. Wait for the microphone.
Byron Ween, Blackstone. EJ, I guess this is a question for you. I mean, we look at all these charts that show the pending liability for healthcare costs for state and local governments. And there's, you know, the current situation is always a little bar, and then the future situation is a very tall bar. And it's a frightening situation. And you sort of approach this on a micro basis, but are we unnecessarily alarmed by the long-term liability facing state and local governments to fund these healthcare and retirement costs in the future? How serious is this problem? Because it doesn't seem to me that the legislators are responding as if this is a calamity about to befall us.
Well, I think that's an excellent question that goes to the heart of all this, because if you discuss this or debate this in a forum with, for instance, people from analysts for labor unions, on the issue of retiree health care in particular, which you referred to, which, unlike pensions, are unabashedly, virtually completely unfunded. It's basically a future liability whose net present value can be calculated, for which no money is being put aside. And if you look at the slope of increase, it's like this, and it basically doubles every year. And what the labor union analysts will tell you is, well, we're paying it now on a pay-go basis, and we'll continue doing that. It becomes very much like the Social Security argument, which is, yes, it's a Ponzi scheme, or maybe you can call it a Ponzi scheme, but whatever it is, we're paying for it now, we'll pay for it in the future, we should have it, what's the problem? And it gets into a fundamental problem of perspectives, really, when you come right down to it, and I think the crowding out argument comes into part of it. It also raises the issue of whether at a certain point, whether accounting has any meaning. Because, for instance, the city of New York, on its combined statement of liability, assets versus liabilities, not including pensions in the liabilities, measured their way or the private sector way, not including them. The city of New York, which now has an unfunded retirement health care liability in the neighborhood of $80 billion, headed toward 100, is already, right now, in a state of what accountants would call balance sheet insolvency. That is, the sum total of what the city owes, including the net present value of its retirement health liability to not yet paid, to generate a whole generation of workers going out indefinite, to the last one's dies 80 years from now, exceeds the total value of everything the city owns by over $100 billion. That's the number for the city of New York. And it gets to the issue when you ask, I had a conversation with a bond credit rating agency about this, and I said, and the city's got a decent credit rating, as you might expect. A city has a very high, relatively high debt and a good credit rating. And you ask a credit rater, well, so why does this have meaning, or, you know? And his answer was, well, unlike a pension, for instance, which again isn't even part of that calculation, this is binding. It's not an obligation like debt because you get a certain point you don't have to pay it. It's contractual. Now, if you're familiar, you have any knowledge of the nature of labor relations and collective bargaining in New York City, as I said to him at the time, and as I frequently said in audiences like this since then, I want you to go out and tell the president of the UFT in public that, we don't have to pay this, so it's not really something we're worried about. And he'll either wink back at you or he will stage a fit. Because it's not easy to say we're not going to pay this. This, mind you, is a city in which employees right now are required to contribute nothing to their health insurance, so whether you're retired or active. So I don't have an easy answer for the question, but I think that is the fundamental question, because what the debate ultimately comes down to, if you do a really good job and have a nice open forum and you really engage in it, on all the issues with a good, honest, adversary on the other side of this, what it ultimately comes down to is, and it's very similar to Social Security, hey, we're paying it. Now it's going to, they take the opposite of the Herb Stein. It is not unsustainable and can continue into the future. And so maybe the nature of dispute is ultimately sort of theological. Do you believe that or not? I don't, because we're already in a situation with the pensions where you're crowded out $7 billion worth of public services in order to remain current with pension funding. And what you're committed to doing now is crowding out more and more public services in the future to remain current with the retiree health care funding, for which you've set aside nothing. So the crowd out is there, even if you argue that in a city as vast and wealthy as New York, that you can fund things indefinitely somehow.
And really on that note, I think you've summed up our discussion this morning, EJ, which is it's difficult to change, but the status quo is sobering and sustainable only at great collateral damage. And so that's where we are. Just 1 minute. We're going to hear when we come back, I'm going to have to ask you to clear the room because we're going to have Governor Daniels as we sit for lunch. Steve Malanga, my colleague, who's really been a pioneer in discussing the power of public sector unions and their influence on all of this, will be introducing Governor Daniels. So please join me in thanking our panel.
I think it is clear how fortunate we are to believe in the power of ideas.
Supply the common sense and the fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.